Alright folks, today I'm bringing you yet another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. First off, huge thanks to all of you for your patience while I've been away the past couple of weeks, and an even bigger thanks for 50,000 subscribers. What an absolutely wild milestone. I seriously appreciate your guys' support. Now, if you're a longtime viewer, you're probably familiar with this series, but if you are new here, environmental storytelling is a filmmaking technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a closer look at the Harrison Memorial Hospital primarily featured in The Walking Dead Season 1. AKA the location that initially introduced us to this dead world in the first place. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through its various appearances across the franchise, including flashbacks and webisodes, before going back and piecing together what we discovered into a coherent story. This topic isn't necessarily as mysterious as some others I've discussed, but it's an extremely dark look into the early days of the outbreak that lends itself well to this style of video, which I couldn't resist diving into. But with that, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments down below, and drop a sub to see more videos like this. Now, the story of this hospital is a little tougher to put together as we have multiple different perspectives to work with, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to start from where we all began. When Officer Rick Grimes opened his eyes and awoke from his coma roughly 2 months after the initial outbreak due to a gunshot wound received in the line of duty, he had found himself the only living being within the Harrison Memorial Hospital as the world had died around him. This medical center was already long gone. Not physically, as the walls still stood, but the hope it could have represented as any sign of life was long dead. Rick, of course, would be left in a state of utter confusion after making his way out of bed as the hallway outside his room resembled a war zone with a single decaying body remaining. Right away, it's clear whatever happened here happened extremely fast as the lights remain flickering all this time later. Morgan later makes it clear the King County power grids went out weeks ago, so it's safe to assume the hospital more than likely ran off a generator unseen on screen, which has only now begun to run out of fuel. Regardless, Rick's journey attempting to find an exit brings him down a particularly rough-looking hallway where he sees his first walkers chained behind the iconic "Don't Dead, Open Inside" door. Initially, it may seem like this is where the soldiers trapped the dead when things went sideways, although the Oath webisode will later elaborate on this and make the scene a little more clear. Here, we see the walls lined with blood and bullet holes while exposed wires dangle from the ceiling. Clearly, this wasn't just a case of walkers invading the halls and the staff getting eaten, and this is shown directly in a flashback through Shane's perspective later on, as we witness military soldiers moving through the halls while executing patients and staff alike. Not walkers, living people, in what's probably one of the more confusing scenes here, as we see other staff members running behind soldiers without being targeted. If I were to guess, the soldiers may have switched from executing their specific targets to purging the hospital altogether once the chaos inside grew out of control. But then again, a soldier checks in on Rick while he's clearly still alive and leaves him be, so this is something I'd like to hear your take on in the comments down below. This scene does explain the burnt up condition of this hallway, however, as we see a soldier fall to the dead while blind firing into the live wires within the drop ceiling. Regardless, once Rick made his way past the bloodied hallway and through the fire escape which marked his way out of this hellhole, we discover where most of these bodies eventually ended up as the loading dock horrifically remains filled with body bags of those who died inside, accompanied by what looks like a military safe zone that was abandoned rather than overrun. This to me is where the story here gets interesting. Why go through the trouble of clearing the hospital and bagging the bodies if they were planning to just abandon the site anyway? The exterior of the hospital looks to have been hit by a tank or some sort of explosive in some areas, while what looks like the soldiers' main centralized camp across the street appears to have suffered similar fire damage. We can actually hear one of these explosions take place during Shane's flashback as a soldier yells out, "Fall back, this place is coming down." But what's truly confusing here is the sheer amount of military vehicles, aircraft, and supplies left behind. There are barely any bodies around this camp, military personnel or civilian aside from those who were bagged. They were obviously putting down and loading up bodies to clear out the hospital, yet for some reason they left before finishing the job. The only cold bodies still moving are those in the cafeteria, so why did the soldiers abandon this area? Normally, most of these details could only be explained through speculation or outside knowledge of the franchise, but thankfully the Oath webisode was made to fill in a couple of these gaps, which will greatly help us piece together some missing links in this story. Now, first things first, I need to address the elephant in the room. Yes, Wyatt Russell was in The Walking Dead. I'm just kidding. The real elephant here is the fact that this clearly isn't the same hospital set used in the premiere. But yes, undoubtedly it is supposed to be Harrison Memorial Hospital taking place in the gap between Shane's escape and Rick's awakening. Now, the first thing of note I took away from this webisode is the fact that every single medical station, FEMA camp, or safe zone in the area was overrun or hostile territory. This helps build the idea this area surrounding King County in particular never really did well in terms of federal response. We know from the Torn Apart webisode, the military initially airlifted some civilians out of the town in order to protect a large population within Atlanta, which obviously did not work out either. So perhaps it's possible this hospital was never actually meant to be a long-term refugee camp for survivors, but a stopgap until the military decided what to do once the gravity of the situation became clear. Now, as the Oath protagonist, Katrina and her injured ally, Paul, enter the hospital. They come across the same war zone-like scene as Rick would a few days to weeks after. But as Katrina attempts to shuffle through the already emptied medical supplies, a walker who stumbled in from outside attacks, only to be taken out by a woman named Gail who claims to be the last surviving doctor of this terrible place. Here, Gail tells Katrina her perspective on what happened, as she states the hospital was indeed receiving supplies from the soldiers every day after the outbreak when suddenly it stopped. But unfortunately, this didn't prevent patients from continuing to arrive, and eventually, without any real sense of order, fights began to break out and people began killing each other for supplies. Gail states while the soldiers were storming the halls, she, along with a young medical intern, hid in a closet within the basement. But when they were inevitably found by men that were once Gail's patients who now wished to take advantage of the situation, they took the intern for their own desires and left Gail as she speculates she was too old. Whatever the reason, she is sure to specify the walking bodies weren't what brought this place down. It was the soldiers. Gail claims to be someone who wishes to help others in whatever ways she can. This includes allegedly being the reason Rick was able to survive his coma as she was taking care of him, even though the gurney Shane blocked the door with remains there during his awakening. But this would also take a dark turn in Gail believing medically assisted death was the best remedy she could possibly offer somebody in pain from this world. She stressed she wasn't a murderer, however. She simply offered others the choice without forcing it upon them, which is exactly what she offers Katrina when Paul appears to have died. Her solution for the dead, again for some reason, was to keep them reanimated and trapped within the cafeteria, explaining why almost every body executed within was bagged outside, yet some walkers remained in isolation. These were the people who wanted out, whether they were survivors of the Purge or simply lost souls who wandered in here after. And although Katrina accepted her offer in dying peacefully, Paul would actually survive his wound and fight his way out of the cafeteria before confronting Gail at gunpoint. It's unclear if she survived this encounter to this day, but I'd say she did not, given the silence that fell upon the hospital once Rick began walking again, as we end off the webisode with Paul spray painting the iconic message on the door while chaining it shut before leaving this place for good. Later on in Season 2, Shane describes his experience in the hospital to Rick, where he says 2 weeks after the outbreak is when his flashback took place. But as we know, Operation Cobalt occurred on the morning of September 10th. So although Shane might have rounded a few days up to say it was 2 weeks after, this actually does fit the timeline we know pretty well if we consider he, Lori, and Carl left King County on the 9th and found themselves stuck in gridlock to witness Operation Cobalt take place that same night or morning. Regardless, we now have a ton of information to work with in order to piece together a coherent story. There are a few aspects that remain a mystery, but I think we have enough to at least take an educated guess on what isn't explicitly known. Although, again, I'm just theorizing based on what I've noticed and my outside knowledge of the franchise, so it's entirely possible I can misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But of course, this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. When the bodies of the dead began reanimating and walking the earth on August 27, 2010, the Harrison Memorial Hospital located in King County, Georgia quickly became the main central staging point for the military in this part of the state, as it was one of the largest medical centers in the region. Smaller FEMA and military camps did exist in the area, but Harrison was meant to be the fallback point for those who weren't able to hold the line. While many civilians were quote-unquote lucky enough to be airlifted out of the town by helicopter and taken to refugee centers in Atlanta during Monument Day, others weren't as fortunate and found themselves stuck within the infested town while searching for aid, which naturally brought them to the hospital's doorstep. At first, the military actively provided Harrison Memorial with supplies and security. Everything from food to medicine, the doctors were being delivered resources on a day-to-day basis as soldiers guarded the hospital's perimeter. The staff were overwhelmed but relatively well off, considering supply lines remained strong and helicopters were actively flying in and out of Atlanta to evacuate the healthy. But as the days went on, more and more civilians began pouring in from the surrounding area as the neighboring medical centers and FEMA camps had gone dark, shifting the military's tone from optimistic and well-organized to distant and apprehensive towards the medical staff, as they had stopped receiving orders from higher authorities altogether. Harrison Memorial had acted as a much-needed lifeline for the area, but with their neighboring safe zones overrun, their supply lines were severed, and eventually the daily deliveries of resources simply stopped coming, despite the soldiers remaining camped outside watching. No staff member could get a straight answer as to what was happening from the soldiers. Their concerns were disregarded as they were simply escorted back inside and commanded to stay put. The helicopters were still flying in and out, but no more civilians were being evacuated. Instead, the pilots were surveying the remnants of the Atlanta refugee centers, as the dead had already taken over the whole city. The medical staff knew something was wrong, but what they didn't realize was that the soldiers were purposely starving them of supplies and waiting for an excuse and opportunity to move in. The doctors were now completely overwhelmed and quickly running out of resources, while patients grew angrier by the hour. It was clear these medical professionals couldn't keep the situation under control, and with the soldiers refusing to provide order to the camp, it would only be a matter of time before the healthy civilians began raiding the medical center for everything they could. The sick could only watch in horror as those who could have once been their neighbors robbed them of their much-needed medications. Chairs and tables were overturned while documents were thrown without care, but this damage was all trivial compared to what followed as the civilians quickly began killing each other for what was stolen. This is exactly what the soldiers were waiting for. Orders had stopped coming through days ago, and the pilots flying in and out of the area were reporting nothing but gruesome scenes from Atlanta. If they were to continue supplying the hospital, they would eventually be left with nothing themselves, as they were now on their own and out in the open. The idea was to initially move in and kill the patients and staff closest to the exits in order for them to turn and do the rest of the work for them. The first real instance we've seen of weaponizing the dead, but as their own began falling to the walkers all the same within the halls, the objective shifted to purging anything that moved in front of them in an effort to prevent themselves from being trapped inside. Fires were breaking out, civilians were panicking and eventually fighting back. It was an absolute war zone, only made worse when helicopters began dropping explosives onto the hospital in an effort to collapse the entrances to prevent the dead from exiting. It seemed like the whole building might have collapsed if they kept this up, so falling back and allowing the dead to storm the halls and purge anything that moved as intended, the soldiers would stand on the outskirts of Harrison Memorial and listen as the screams faded to moans. What followed was an immediate attempt to systematically exterminate the dead hall by hall while collecting whatever medical supplies remained. There was a plan for the soldiers to clean Harrison up and occupy it as their new base. They went as far as to bag the bodies they took out with the idea of burning the corpses, but way too many issues came up with this location. The structural integrity was compromised, while more and more desperate civilians continued arriving, only to be executed all the same. Some exits may have been barricaded or collapsed, but new blind spots had been made as a result of the damage alone. It was no longer viable as a legitimate base, but it was the burning glow of Atlanta on September 10th that really sent them packing, as Operation Cobalt had been executed unexpectedly to those in rural safe zones. Anybody surviving the flames would surely be heading their way, and for all they knew, the rural camps were about to be bombed next. So leaving everything exactly as it was within the hospital, including bodies yet to be bagged on the ground, the few remaining soldiers would pack what little supplies they could carry and take off in as many military vehicles as possible. This place was meant to be a fallback point, but with no service members ever arriving and the loss of many during the purge, most of what was intended to last the soldiers through this outbreak had to be left behind. The soldiers watched and waited as the hospital fell into chaos, all for a base and supplies. But what's kind of ironic is that they walked out with far less than what they had before they began this raid. However, once the halls fell silent and the soldiers peeled away from the site of their crime to start a new life in the countryside, a doctor named Gale, along with a few other survivors, would crawl out of their closets and hiding spots and witness the remnants of what had happened for themselves. They had survived, but everything was lost. So using what little resources were left to end the suffering of others, Gale would fill the cafeteria with those who gave up and remain as the only doctor left in order to watch over the one who somehow slipped through the cracks in all of this, before one day presumably meeting her end all the same, along with the memory of what took place here. Alright, now, this interpretation of the story isn't perfect by any means, but I think it ties most of what we've discussed together neatly. Harrison was meant to be a fallback point for the military in the surrounding area, but fear took precedence over duty, and what followed was the first real instance of the dead being weaponized by the people who were there to protect them nonetheless. The only way it makes sense for Rick to have survived the massacre, in my opinion, is if the soldier who checked on him decided to save his bullets and let the dead take him out. And if by some miracle nobody happened to check what was behind that gurney when they were clearing the hospital before they abandoned it. Although when it comes to the scorch marks on the building within the military camp, I kind of have to chalk it up to collateral damage during the bombings, as we see no bodies in that area. Either way, these are just my theories on the situation, and I'm extremely excited to hear what you guys think happened here. Do you think my theory is accurate? Do you think the evidence points to something else being the case? Or was there something I missed that you were able to notice? I want to hear all your thoughts on what could have happened here in the comments down below. But that is gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.